Retro.
Yeah.
Electro. Tech.
Oh yeah.
Hey, turn the lights back on. Wow. Retro electro tech. When real audio ruled the world.
Well, hello there once again, ladies and gentlemen. This is Retro Ernest of Retro Electro Tech. And here on the bench, I have these two Marantz 4430's that I've been working on over time. And they're completed. The only thing I'm doing is setting the DC levels and the bias. So I'm going to go over briefly, try to keep it as concise as possible, the adjustments that I'm making. And yeah, just go from there. I'm only going to do one unit on camera, even though I'm doing both of them at the same time, going back and forth here between the two. But other than that, let me go ahead and get started. Alright, so before I get into the process, I'll just mention briefly that I did another video on these units, these 4430's, and the purpose of that video was really just to go over what I knew I had to do right off the bat. For example, some of you may recall, if you watched the previous video where I was introducing these, and I was just talking about what I knew I had to do off the bat. For example, the broken input selector switch shaft, and I touched on how I went about repairing that and whatnot. Now there was a lot of work I ended up having to do on these, other than pulling out all the controls and switches and going into a deep dive multi-flush solvent cleaning, the reintroduction of a little bit of a lubricant here and there as needed where needed to get these controls working smoothly and all that stuff. These controls were in rough shape on both units. I think these units had been sitting around for quite a while and all that. And the fact of the matter is they're 50-year-old units. So anyways, aside from that, there was a lot of odds and ends work. Like I said, I had to work on the phono stage of this unit. I had to replace a section of shielded cable for one of the channels in the phono stage. Work on the input jacks, the phono inputs and all that. They were intermittent, so just a lot of stuff like that. Touching up solder joints and so forth and so on. Doing the relays in both of these units, and yeah. So, anyways. Let me go ahead and move on to what I'm doing here, because I'm not going to sit here explaining everything I did and what have you. I'll touch bases with the customer on that when he comes to pick them up. But as far as the biasing process and setting the DC levels and all that, yeah, you can see that what I have going on right here is two sets of probes, okay? So one for the front, one for the rear, because this is a quad unit, so there's a front channel, a rear channel on each right and left channels. Okay, so front and rear on each. So I'm clipped on to where I need to be clipped onto to monitor and set bias. So, anyways, I'm not going to point the camera to the underside of the board and show you the markings, but I will do that on the bottom board here. So I don't have to do any fancy camera work and weird angles and all that. So let me go ahead and do that. I'll show you on the bottom board where I'm clipped onto. Okay, so this is what we have going on. It's very well marked here. You see you have all these posts that you can clip onto, and everything is marked, J, 610, 614, 616, 612, so forth, on down the line. So it's all covered in the service manual as far as the steps, so that's why I'm only going to touch on them briefly. So, for example, on this channel here, our left channel, you're going to want to clip onto, and never mind the noise in the background. I have a scanner on in the background, seeing what all the druggies and criminals are doing in the town here. So anyways, positive on 613 and negative on 629, okay? And it looks like on this channel here, on the left channel, this is the rear portion of the channel. Over here is the front portion of our left channel, and over here you want to clip onto 614, your positive probe 614, and your negative on 630. Okay, and this here looks like it's your you know, your front left, rear left. Okay, and it's opposite on the top channel, but that's just because the way I have the unit flipped around and oriented and all that. But it's all the same thing is the point. You'll get it once you do it, but it's very easy because everything is marked. You got these posts to clip onto. So let me get back to the channel I'm working on, and I'll show what VRs, variable resistors, those trimmers that you turn with your little screwdriver or whatever. I'll show you what trimmers I'm utilizing to get the bias in check. Okay, so you can see the 4 trimmer pots here. So our 2 outer, okay, trimmers are for bias, and these 2 inner trim pots are for DC adjustment. So these are the fronts and these are the rears. So that's really all there is to it. So we have our, you know, and this of course is the right channel. So we have our front right bias, our front right DC, our rear right DC, and our rear right bias. So right now I'm tweaking these, and let me go ahead and point the camera down to the meters. All right, so here's our meters here. All right. And you can see one channel we're at about, you know, almost 10 millivolts, which is what factory calls for. And over here we're at about, what, 12 and a half, whatever. And again, like I said before, you know, the bias will bounce around a little bit as it tracks and all that. So anyways, this one here, let me bring it down a little bit. This meter here is monitoring the right rear. So you probably remember what trimmer that is. If not, rewind. So let me go ahead and tweak it a little bit, bring it down just a hair. Yeah, so right about there. Pretty good, pretty good. All right. Okay, so what's all this bias stuff and why do we want to set it? So this is to some of you newer guys, obviously. And I'm just going to put it in simple terms and use this analogy of a car's engine, okay? And let's look at these amp channels as carburetors, okay? Dual carburetors, 2 channels, right? That we need to adjust to keep the idle of the engine purring along nice and smooth, okay? Because remember, we're setting what? Idle current, right? Our bias, idle current. So there's that comparison of an engine idling, these amp channels idling when there's no signal going on, okay? They're just sitting there at idle. Same thing when a car is just sitting at idle and it's not moving yet. We want the idle to be set where it's supposed to be so that the engine is just sitting there, just motoring along, nice and smooth, nice and efficient. So we got that all established, that there's idling going on here, just like there's idling going on with a vehicle. So if we're thinking of dual carburetors, we want to adjust those carburetors so that the fuel flow, and think of the flow of fuel as our audio signal, okay? So we want to set the channels, we want to set the idle of those channels, just like we want to set the idle of the carburetor so that fuel is flowing efficiently, it's steady, but it's efficient, and as a result of that, the engine is idling nice and smooth and quiet, okay? So if the idle is too low, you know, your carburetors aren't set right, you'll know when your idle is obviously too low because it almost sounds like it's going to stall out, and sometimes it does stall out. But you know, the idle's way down. What happens in that case when you drop your foot on the gas? Well, sometimes it'll sputter, right? It won't really go. It'll kind of, you know, sputter and all that, and sometimes it wants to stall, and then finally, you know, it'll start moving. But you have that situation going from idle to, to drive, to wanting to move forward, where you get that sputtering and whatnot. Same thing with the amp channels when they are at idle. When you inject your music signal, then you get some, comparable sputter, if you will, and I'll put up a photo of what's known as crossover distortion. Okay, so what I'm pointing to here, this crossover point here, you see this notch? Well, that shouldn't be there. So there's not a smooth transition of that signal. Let's say a sine wave in this case. There shouldn't be that notch, that crossover distortion that would be comparable to sputtering. All right, so there's that. Same thing with an idle that's too high. Think of a car when the idle is way too high. Well, it's not going to be idling efficiently. It's going to burn more fuel. The engine's going to heat up. It's going to get really hot. Same thing with when the idle is set way too high on an amplifier, the amp channels, when we don't have those carburetors adjusted right and the idle's way up there, then what happens? The amp channels, you put your hand on them, they feel a lot hotter than they should be or warmer than they should be at idle. So we don't want a high idle, we don't want a low idle. We have to get it right at that point that factory specifies, hence our bias current, okay? So that's what we're doing here to assure that the amp channels are idling efficiently and passing signal, that fuel, efficiently as well, so that everything sounds good. We don't have that crossover distortion, or the amp isn't running too warm, or whatever the case. Okay, so both of these units are wrapped up, and I know I didn't demonstrate the setting of our DC offset, but that's okay because it's really straightforward, just measuring at the speaker terminals. Also too, there's some posts on the amplifier boards. Remember I pointed out those posts and all that, the J13, J14 and all that stuff. Okay, well those, and it's noted in the service manual. This is a very well documented unit, so the instructions in that regard are very clear. And yeah, again, there's two ways you can measure at those, on the boards or the speaker terminals. And I pointed out the trimmers for both the bias and the DC, so I think I explained enough to where, yeah, it's doable, okay, just by following my instructions. You can go back, whatever, but if not, it's all in the service manual. Anyways, so I'm audio testing things. Everything is doing okay. I have signal fed into all the inputs, phono, tape, auxiliary, and yeah, FM and all that stuff, tuners working. So let me just go ahead and demonstrate that real quick. And let me reach over here, and this is going to be copywritten stuff, so I'm just going to do it real quick, turn up the volume real quick, and that's it.
I hear you calling. I'm coming back to you.
Okay, so that's just a CD that's piped into the auxiliary. Let me go ahead and switch it over to tape. Now tape, I just have a signal coming in from the function generator because I don't want to hook up a deck and all that, so whatever. Okay, so that's looking good. And then I'm going to move on over to phono. Okay, that's a piece of vinyl, obviously, that I have playing. And then FM. Let me see. And we have our stereo light there, so we have multiplex. Everything's good there. I'm going to get all kinds of little copyright claims just for those little short sections that I played, I'm sure, but it is what it is. Anyways, everything is working really well with this unit. Let me swap on over to the other unit. And like I said, or I may have mentioned, I'm going to do some more testing off camera before the customer arrives. Some power testing, things like that, more monitoring of things. a little bit of cosmetic stuff, but other than that, based on what I was commissioned to do and just repair work, not restoration work and all that stuff, so that the gentleman could sell these in working condition. Yeah, so great. I did what I could do, in other words. So let me go ahead and swap these units over. Okay, so here we are with the other unit. I have a station tune in. We have our multiplex, our stereo light. We have all the indicator lights work. The meter lamps are out. I don't remember what the access is to the lamps off the top of my head for the meters. I know the dial face is a big ordeal to have to go through and removing the plate and scoring around the plate to through the adhesive and pulling that out and blah 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 blah. A lot of stuff which I don't have time to do at the moment. If the meter lamps are accessible without a big teardown, then fine. But I hate when they do that with these units and they make the access to the lamps a big ordeal. But whatever, that's another story. But anyways, it works. Okay, so that's all good. And then let me go ahead and switch over to the phono. Okay, there you go. That song was already approaching the end. And then here's our tape. Again, that signal coming in. All right, that's looking good. And now our CD.
No need to worry, there ain't no hurry.
Okay, so again, this unit is working great as far as the audio and everything else. Pretty good. So anyways, like I said, if I can, I'll take care of a few cosmetics, including the meter lamps and all that. But otherwise, this is done. I've done all I can do with these. And thanks for tuning in, guys. As I always say, peace, love, music, and the vintage audio that brings it to your ears. Till next time, y'all take care.
This has been a Spinning Head production.